So this is React. And I've alluded to the fact that there is also React Native. So this is all on the web. Everything we've done so far is on the web. But there's also a library called React Native. And you use the same basic library to create compiled native apps for iOS and Android. And you'd be surprised at how easily this translates. So you're no longer using divs and H1s and paragraphs and ULs and all that stuff, because that stuff doesn't exist on native. This is not the web anymore. But building components and all that stuff is just the same, and JavaScript is the same. You're just no longer dealing with DOM elements or even replicas of DOM elements. You have a bunch of native elements that have names like Vue and stuff like that. But it's surprisingly similar. And it's super well documented. And there are even frameworks, like there's something called Native Base, which is kind of like Foundation or Bootstrap or something for native. And it's not that hard to translate your skills to that thing. Super well documented. And so you can't use CSS either, of course, because again, it's not the web. But you can style it with something very, very similar to CSS. Very, very similar to Flexbox in particular. You can't use other layout styles like floats and that kind of nonsense. But you have to use that method that we used on the first couple of components where we kind of assigned it using CSS, using a style prop. You can't actually have style sheets that look like real CSS using CSS syntax. You have to do it using JavaScript syntax, which is part of why we did it that way on the first couple of components, because it's good practice. So check that out. It's fun. There are a lot of tutorials. It's pretty neat to be able to build something and get it running on your actual physical device as a real native app. So check it out. React Native. It's good stuff.
Does Facebook have like a React Native like starter app?
So Facebook does not have that thing. There is Create React Native app. You'll notice that Create React Native app, unlike Create React app, is not a Facebook project. It's React community. It's maintained by the community. It's nice. I don't use it. There are just a few more limitations than there are. Plus, it's kind of unnecessary because the React Native command line interface sort of does it for you already. Like React Native just inherently builds out this project for you that you can use as the basis for yours. You sort of don't need a starter project. But there are lots and lots of starter projects. And there are a lot more starter projects for React than just Create React app. Create React app just happens to be official, super well maintained, is kept up to date very, very well, and supports a lot of features. And remember, you can always eject if you need to change the configuration from what they did. And the same goes for Create React Native app. You can eject it as well if you need to change the configuration. But out of the box, you can't use any true native components with it. So if you ever need to use any real native features, if you need to do more than just make something that you could have totally done on the web, but you happen to be doing it on mobile, if you're doing any more than that, Create React Native app isn't going to work unejected. It uses something called Expo, which is super cool and gets you up and running really fast, but also has just a few too many limitations, I think. So if you just look at the React Native documentation, on the Getting Started page, it has the quick start, which actually does use Create React Native app, even though it's not an official thing. But if you look at build projects with native code, you'll use React Native CLI, and you'll call React Native init and then the name of your project, and that kind of does the same thing. It already creates this project for you. By far, the hardest part of all of this is just getting it so that you can run anything on your device. Because to do iOS development, you have to have Xcode, and you have to be using a Mac. That's just true of iOS development, period. If you're using Expo and are using Create React Native app, you can get around that. But if you're using any real native code, you have to use Xcode, and you have to use a Mac. And by use Xcode, I mean you have to use Xcode to compile the thing. but you never actually have to fire that thing up until you get ready to actually release it, as long as it's installed. Those tools have to be installed. Android is kind of a living nightmare. You install Android Studio, which is huge, and you have to have a virtual Android device, which is unbelievably huge. And you should probably have more than one because Android devices are incredibly different from one another, and there's about 1 trillion of them. So it takes a long time to get started just because you have to get all that stuff installed. But as long as you can just if you have a Mac and you can just run it in the iOS simulator, you can get that happening fairly fast. So the initial setup and just getting the darn thing to run is a bit of a chore in both cases. The getting started page, building projects with native code, will tell you how to do it. But it does take a while and requires some huge downloads. If you do it the other way, using Create React Native App, it is a bit faster. But once you have all that initial setup out of the way, it's not bad, and the development process is not that different from using React. It's a little different because you still have native, actual compiled code happening, but the dev tools are super nice, and you still have things that will live refresh it for you as you're testing. So that's a thing that's worth checking out. And back on the just regular old React front, remember how much stuff there is in Create React App that we never looked at. There's all kinds of stuff in here. Have a look sometime through the table of contents, see if you see anything interesting. Check out more tutorials. We've barely scratched the surface with this stuff. We've really just barely touched React. It's a whole thing. And some of the things that no doubt already annoy you, like suppose we need to get something from the app component way down to note form. Well, you have to go through main first, right? You have to pass this prop from app to main, from main to note form. And if you're building a large app, that may be many, many levels deep. Because oftentimes you try to make your components as small as they can possibly be so that they're nice and testable and everything and maintainable. And that kind of stuff gets real old. There are lots of solutions for that. So just in the last couple of releases of React, in the last few months, there's a new API for something called context. So context has been there all along, but was not recommended to use. There was a huge warning on the documentation page for it basically saying, do not use this. But it was a way of kind of achieving that thing, passing data from one component to another without hitting all components in between. So the context API in React 16 is a way to solve that. But the way most people solve it is using something called Redux. So there are all these other state management libraries. So you don't necessarily have to use your component state and props for everything. If you have a complex app with more complicated needs than we had for this project, oftentimes you'll use some other state management library like Redux. Redux is not part of React. It is not it's not a Facebook thing, but it is super widely used. But it's a whole kind of new way of thinking. So if you're interested in learning more about the React ecosystem, I do recommend learning Redux because it is used a lot, but it's a whole thing. There's actually a free tutorial from Wes Boss, whose other tutorials I think I recommended in the prereqs. I think it's just called Redux. Let's see. I'll just look it up. Wes Boss Redux, and I'm pretty sure this is free. LearnRedux.com. Yeah. LearnRedux.com. It is free, so if you're interested in learning that, check it out. It uses a slightly older version of React, so some things may not be exactly the way we did them, but by and large, it all works, and this is going to create an Instagram clone. So it's kind of fun, too. It's just a bunch of videos. Worth checking out. The Redux dev tools are really, really cool. So it does assume that you know React a little bit. I think the main thing you'll see that's out of date is React Router. It uses an older version of React Router that looked pretty different, but it's not that big a deal. So yeah, check that out if you're interested in learning more. So there's a lot of stuff you can do from here, and we'll share some links on the website.